Thank you for joining me today for the conclusion of our study that we've entitled Dealing with Anxiety. As we've talked these 4 weeks now, we've dealt with different passages in Scripture and the words that the Bible uses to talk about worry and anxiety. Basically, the main word that's used for worry and anxiety is a word that simply means to divide the mind. And so worry, anxiety is a divided mind. Paul uses it a couple of times to talk about cares and concerns that are valid concerns, his cares for the churches. But he is concerned about it, obviously, and it divides his mind, so it's still a part of that word thought and word group. But then there are specific times, Philippians chapter 4, where we talked last week, and Matthew chapter 6, and the words of Jesus there, where he uses the word worry several times, and suggests that we should not worry. And so we've tried to flesh those things out a little bit and help us to make some distinctions there. Today, as we conclude, we're going to be talking more about what causes us to worry and why we're different in those things. Our text for the day, though, if you might turn there with me, is 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. I want to once again mention the quote that I think is one of the best statements I've ever read on the topic of worry and anxiety. That's why I've intentionally mentioned it, I think about 3 out of the 4 weeks here. And it's a quote from Corrie ten Boom from her writings. It says simply, "Worrying is carrying tomorrow's load with today's strength. It's carrying 2 days at once. It's moving into tomorrow ahead of time." She goes on to say, and goes on to write, "Worry does not so much empty tomorrow of its sorrow, but it empties today of its strengths." And therein lies the difficulty with worry and anxiety. If it didn't matter, if it didn't hurt anything, then we'd just say it's a waste of our mind, or it's a misuse of our time. But the reality is, it does get in the way. And it does make today different. And oftentimes, most of the times, doesn't change tomorrow anyway. Think with me just a moment along the lines of what causes us to worry. And this is not a scientific or a clinical analysis here necessarily, just a common sense one in the ways that we might debate many things as to its cause. You basically end up with 3 options. One thing that might cause us to worry is our own experiences in life. You know, some folks have had much more difficulty than others have. Some have had much more trauma than others have. And so their level of anxiety because of those things might simply be because of what has happened to them. Also, under the heading of experiences, you could also talk about the habits that we formed. If we're not careful, we get into a habit, and then we just simply do it without thinking, without intending to, and some people get into a habit of worry. Another option is kind of gets us down to the debate we have about a lot of things and the basic nature-nurture argument. Many people, I would suggest, worry because they've been nurtured to worry. Maybe they were raised by parents who had a high anxiety level, or what was modeled out in front of them in their growing up years was worry and anxiety at a high level. You know, you may have been raised by parents who were very anxious and who had a lot of anxieties. You may have been raised by parents who had none at all, and we can be affected, obviously, by that. And the other obvious option is nature. You know, the person that you are, or your personality. One person tends to worry more than another person does. Many of you have, like myself, become fans of what's known as the Enneagram. And it's an instrument. It's actually a very old instrument that's been made popular again, and a lot of writings about it in the last few years. But it basically divides us into 9 groups. In Enneagram speak, you are a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. And if you're familiar with it, you would say, oh, well, now I'm a 6. that means I'm a worrier. Or if you're a worrier, you're probably a 6, maybe a 4, possibly even a 5. Certainly not if you're a 7, not most likely if you're a 3. One thing that's made the Enneagram so popular is the fact that, number one, to start with, there are 9 options for personality types. And then much of the writings talk about either an unhealthy, an average, or a very healthy one of each of those numbers. So now we're at 27 options, and then there are some discussions within those writings about, a 3 in anger might become an 8. A 3, might become something else. And so it's broad, and that's the point I'm making. But it does point out that by our personality, by who we are, just who we are as a person, some are more inclined to worry. Some are more inclined not to worry. Now, lest we think, well, I worry more than I should, so then that makes me not as good as someone else. Because worrying, seems like something that a Christian is not supposed to do, so that's something that troubles me, so I must not be very spiritual. Well, the reality is, worry may be a struggle that you have or that I have. But the simple truth is, we all have struggles. What you struggle with may not be what the person next to you struggles with. And what they struggle with might not be a concern to you at all. And so we all do have struggles. Yours might not be what mine is. Mine might not be what yours is. But we do all have struggles. So we need not be too hard on ourselves if our difficulty, or one of our difficulties, is that we're too anxious or that we worry too much. Other people have their struggles too. And we all must work against the things that we struggle with. We ought to, we need to learn to work in our strengths and to pull back in our weaknesses. Work on our weaknesses, work in our strengths. Go with me now for just a moment to 1 Peter chapter 5. And in the latter part of the paragraph just preceding this, he's talked about humility. So that's sort of the topic that we're in. That's the theme that's going on here. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Or he says, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So then we have the new paragraph, verses 6 and 7, we'll notice. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Now, a couple of things of note here is that he says, casting all your cares on him because he cares for you. Now, this word could have been, as a matter of fact, I think the King James says cares. The NIV says anxieties. I read the ESV for the most part. It says anxieties. And I think there is a version or two that uses the term worry here. But it's all the same word and all the same idea. Casting your anxieties on him because he cares for you. And so the suggestion is not simply, if you have an anxiety, then forget it. If you have a worry, then get it off your mind, that you're foolish for being drawn down by it. But he says, cast your anxieties on him, for he cares for you. And so the point is that if you struggle with it, God is there to help you with it. And it even seems to imply that some of those things are things that we can hardly get by without being anxious over or be concerned over, but that the answer is to bring it to God. When we talk about worry, though, we're mostly talking about those things that we think we shouldn't worry about, those things that are not simply the cares and the concerns that we ought to have, but those things that monopolize us, those things that vie for our energy, and those things that we would see as more negative. So from this point forward, that'll be the way we use the idea of anxiety and worry. Worries do very easily divide into two groups. We suggested that a week or two ago. They divide into two very simple groups. One is worries divide into groups of things I can change and things I cannot change. Now, of the things I can change, then maybe those are just simply the cares that I need to be concerned about and the things I need to give attention to. There are things that I can change, things I've said that need to be apologized for, things I've done that need maybe to be repented of or maybe need to be fixed in some sort of way. So there are things that I can change by giving thought to it and by pondering it and debating what I should do. But then the most part of what we think of as worries are those things that I cannot change. Those things that I cannot change. And it's simple for someone who doesn't struggle with worry to say, well, you can't change that, so quit worrying about it. Now, it wouldn't surprise many of you to know that someone telling you to stop worrying about something probably doesn't lower your anxiety about that thing. It just reminds you every time you're thinking about it that you're still worrying about it. And so it actually raises your level of anxiety rather than lowering it. Some people find it easier to deal with something and let it go quicker. There are things that happen, and once they've happened, many things simply cannot be changed. We can frustrate ourselves over it. We can worry about it. We can fret over it for a long period of time, or we can try to decide what we need to do with it to deal with it in the most healthy way. But most things, once they cannot be changed, we're trying to get them to a point that we're not anxious about them. We're trying to put them where they need to be. One of the categories that probably is one of those things we need to work on more than some of the other categories of things we might worry about. And there is that sort of two groups, as we've suggested, even under the two groups. There's the things I cannot change, the things I can change, the things I cannot change. But even in those things that I cannot change, there are still two groups. There are real things that I cannot change. An event that happened, I cannot change it. I cannot undo that event. I think about an automobile accident, fender bender, not something terribly serious, just simply, you weren't paying attention, you ran into the back of someone, or you ran over your mailbox, or you did this or you did that, and it's frustrating. And we hate that we've done it. We hate that it happened. But the reality is we can't change it, so what do we do with it? But it's a real thing that I cannot change because it's simply an event that happened. But then the other side of that, the other category here, is under the things that I cannot change, there's the real things, and then there are the imagined things. And if there is a category of worry that we need to work on more than any other place, it's probably in this category. Imagined things, things that I am creating in my imagination. Abraham Hicks made this statement. He said, worrying is using your imagination to create something you don't want. Now, when you think of it that way, it sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? When you think of it that way, it sounds rather harmful. It sounds rather debilitating. I'm actually using my mind to create something that I don't want. But somehow, at least many of us, we do that and we justify it by saying or by thinking at least, that we're preparing ourselves for the potential problem that might arise. That sort of takes us back as we bring this topic to a summary of what we tried to enlarge upon last week. And that is that There are two simple ways I think that we can be helped as we try to learn not to worry. We try to teach ourselves not to be so anxious. The first thing, we talked about it last week, was to trust that God will provide. You know, that's the import of Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 through all the way through 33 and 34, is that you can't add a hair to your head. You can't add an inch to your stature. You can't add a moment to your day by worrying about it. Now, the simple reality is you can take hairs out of your head and you can take moments out of your day by worrying about them, and maybe that's the reason Jesus uses those illustrations. But he makes the statement there that don't worry about what you're going to put on, what you're going to eat. You know, those basic things of life ought not to be matters of anxiety, because our job, according to verse 33, is to seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to us. In other words, God is going to provide for us, and God's going to provide our basic needs. The other thing that we mentioned that helps us maybe learn not to worry is having a plan. You know, you may have a plan as a family if something happens to your house in the middle of the night. Each person is to go to a certain place, or one person is to contact one other person, and then they go to a certain place. But we have a plan. We have an emergency plan. Most businesses have a variety of emergency plans. Some of them with actual, tragedy and trauma, or with weather, and some of them more just business things, financial things. But they have an emergency plan. And so the question is, spiritually, should we have an emergency plan? And do we need to think all of those scenarios out? Well, spiritually speaking, I think we do have an emergency plan. And I think that emergency plan is given to us right there in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. Casting all your cares on him because he cares for you. You see, our plan is that if something bad happens, we're going to take it to God in prayer. And so we don't have to worry about the perceived possibility of what might happen, because we have a plan. Our plan is that whatever happens, we're going to take it to God in prayer. And it's the very thing that Paul talks about in the passage that we studied last week of Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. He starts by saying, don't be anxious about anything, but by prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God. It seems to be that the most important thing said about worry and anxiety is that you're not supposed to carry it alone. And that if we trust in God and we lay it at his feet, then we no longer have to be concerned about it then. And I think that's probably the real lesson to be taken away from this brief look at worry and anxiety. Yes, worry and anxiety is a greater struggle for some than others. We need not beat ourselves up over that. We need not be even more anxious because of that. Because even that person who says, I don't know why you worry, I don't worry about those sort of things. Well, the reality is they have their own struggles and things that they are challenged by that probably don't bother you at all. And so we all have struggles. We learn to deal with our struggles. We learn to lay our struggles at the feet of our God. And we learn, as we go along, to work on improving our weaknesses, and then to spend most of our time, if we can, working in our strengths. Thank you so much for joining me for this study, these 4 weeks. I'll give you a little heads up on what's happening over the next few weeks. We're going to be talking in this session at 6:30 on Wednesday night about the things we say. And it's going to be a broad discussion. We'll divide it up into 4 or 5 weeks. But also, we're going to re-engage our growth groups from the spring. And the plan is that you listen to this video at 6:30, and then 5 minutes after it concludes, we're not putting a specific time on it because these videos last varying amounts of time. And so 5 minutes after this video is over, then you're asked to join a Zoom meeting with that growth group. Now, we'll be publishing some information this weekend to let you know, to remind you of the groups, and also to give an opportunity for anybody who was not in one of those groups, or maybe someone that's new, to join one of those groups, and we would encourage you to do so. But again, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining me for this study. I trust you're having a good day, and would wish you a good week, and would love to see you on Sunday.